Hello, my name is Ashley Chapman, founder of Justice U and Engage Together, and your host for this very special conversation on how educators can end and prevent human trafficking. Today, we have a very special guest, one of our favorite leaders on this topic, Jeneé Littrell, who will be sharing with you her expertise on what schools can and should do to protect kids and youth in our schools today. Before we get started, though, a couple of housekeeping items. First, this session is recorded, and you'll be receiving that recording on the other side of today's event. Second, if you have questions that you'd like to submit for us to discuss today, you can do that through the Q&A feature, either on your laptop or on your smartphone. Just reach out to our team and submit your question. They'll do their best to get it to us, and we'll do our best to answer it in the time that we have. Also, take a look at that chat feature throughout today's session, as our team will be sharing with you resources that we're discussing today and links to go to learn more. Lastly, there's no possible way that during this 30-minute session, we'll be able to cover everything you need to know about how the education community can engage on this very important issue. However, on the other side of this event, you will receive a quick start guide for educators that will provide an excellent roadmap for action items that you can consider stepping into right away and resources for where to go to learn more. Because Engage Together exists to provide you so many resources in your journey ahead, and especially in your journey to move from awareness about an issue to action in your local community, I'd like to welcome Alana Flora, co-founder of Engage Together and director of everything that we do in that universe, to share more. Alana?
Hey, Ashley, thank you. And for anyone that's not familiar with Engage Together, we exist to come alongside and support individuals and organizations with the ideas, the insight, the resources, the tools, and the connections they need to be able to prevent human trafficking and end it in their local communities. We've worked with thousands of justice advocates and with programs and organizations across the United States and world to understand what's happening in their communities. What does human trafficking look like? What are the changes and challenges? What are the successes? What's working and what's not working? And what resources exist that others need to know so that we can provide that information back to individuals and communities. So our toolkits, our discussion guides, our blogs, our quick start guides, they're all filled with the resources you need to move from awareness to action. We're passionate that everyone is uniquely positioned to engage with the skills, the talents, the resources, the network that they already have. They just need to know how to connect that in their local community. So we have resources to help you map and understand where there are strengths in your community and where there are gaps, and to help you move from impact to greater impact in your communities. And that's part of the reason we're so excited for this event tonight, especially for the education community. Whether you are a teacher, a school nurse, an administrator, or a school bus driver, you are interacting with youth every single day. You are perfectly positioned to be able to identify and to respond. And so we're thrilled to have Jeneé Littrell with us to be able to give us the insights, the experience, and the understanding that we need to know to be able to share with you all on how educators are uniquely positioned to engage. We look forward to this conversation tonight.
Thank you, Alana. And welcome, Jeneé. So we are thrilled to have you with us. And obviously, Alana and we've known you for a bit of time, and you're one of our favorite people in all the world. But our listeners might not know you. So would you just take a moment before we dive in to introduce yourself, share anything about who you are that you'd like to share, and especially how you became aware of and engaged in this work to help end human trafficking?
Sure, I'd be happy to. And thank you, Ashley and Alana, for having me join you tonight. I'm so excited to be here. And I really want to thank the audience for taking time out in your evening, depending on where you are in the nation, or maybe in your afternoon. But being here, as you just heard Alana say, is the first step to moving to action, or maybe it's a continued step in action you've already taken. So as you just heard from Alana and Ashley, I am an educator, and I have been in education my entire career. And in 2003, I was working as a counselor at a local high school in San Diego County. And we had partnerships with our child and family partners, our probation, our NGOs, and we felt really good about the frameworks that we were co-leading to support students and families and really help people thrive. And it was in 2003 when I was contacted by one of my social worker friends in Child and Family Services, letting me know that one of my students who had been missing for 6 months had been found, and that indeed she had been trafficked for the last 6 months. Well, I remember in 2003 when that social worker called to alert me and co-develop a plan to help support that student returning to school. I remember thinking, this is probably going to stand out for me as I move through my career and I move into retirement. This will probably be an extreme case of abuse. Well, indeed, flash forward to 2009, that student was just the tip of an iceberg. We started to understand the extent to which human trafficking was happening in San Diego County, but not just San Diego County, the state and across the nation. And it was through working together with our students and our partners that we started to understand really the prevalence of it, but also the ways in which our students are targeted. Our schools are targeted, that exploiters know where students go to school. They know the routes that they take to and from. They also know where our most vulnerable students go to school, and they intentionally target those students. And so at that time, I thought, let me reach out to Las Vegas. Let me reach out to the state of California, CDE, or to Washington, DC, and find other places that clearly must have been dealing with this, which I did. And indeed, they had been dealing with it, but no one had developed a way to start addressing it. So we just started plugging forward and figuring it out. And we really engaged with the expertise across our disciplines, but we learned together with the expertise and the learning from the survivors. And it was through that work that really in 2009, I stopped and realized I thought that case was going to stand out for me. At that point in 2009, it was more than 50% of my job. And we had now, by that time, identified hundreds of students in our school district that were suspected victims or survivors. And we had trained thousands of educators, thousands of social workers, nurses, law enforcement, because it took all of us working together to understand. So I'm so excited to be here, and I'm so grateful that I had the opportunity in sharing the learning that we came across in San Diego County with the Department of Education, and realizing I don't want the next person, when they're working with a survivor, to think, what should I do? I wanted them to be prepared to know what to do, which is why I'm so happy you're here tonight.
Yes, thank you, Jeneé, so much. Yeah, just amazing work there. And in that quick start guide you're going to get, we do highlight that federal protocol that Jeneé just mentioned. And you can access that and take a look. It's just a great roadmap too for what your schools can do. But we have a number of questions, Jeneé, to get to, questions that we know are on the hearts and minds of the education sector, questions submitted to us from our listeners this evening. So let's dive in and start peppering you with those. I promise, as an attorney, I will not make it feel like a cross-examination. And I will be asking both, yeah, I'll be asking both Jeneé and Alana, who both are coming from education, myself too, by the way, ESL before law school, just to really chime in here. So we want this to just be a very dynamic opportunity. So here we go. If you're seeing me look this way, it's to look at questions, and here we go. First question on the table is, why do you think educators are so uniquely positioned to engage on this issue?
I think there's a variety of reasons why educators are so uniquely positioned. But most importantly, I think it's because they are the ones each and every day in the faces with children. They get to know the children. First of all, educators approach this profession with the right reason. They care about children and they want to help children have the most successful futures, whether that's a kindergarten classroom, a fourth grade classroom, or high school. So they care. And they have I don't know, it's probably the sixth sense that teachers get. Their gut is so wise. There's something that's not right here. And it's true. Oftentimes they're able to detect students maybe with learning disabilities, students that might have some mental health needs, but they can also detect when there's just something not right. So I think educators can really, with a little training and a little support, can use that sixth sense and can detect when somebody, maybe it's not them, maybe it's a social worker or somebody else on their campus, should check in with a student to see if that student's okay. But they get to see that change of behavior. They get to see if that attendance pattern changes. They get to see the writings that the students submit in their class assignments. They get to see a lot of red flags, and oftentimes they don't know what to do with it. So that's why I think educators are uniquely positioned, but I also think organizations such as yours are so incredibly important, because once you get it, you have to know what to do with it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. And Alana, one of the questions coming right this second from our group is, we're talking about education and we're zoning in right on K through 12 here, but What might it look like for universities, for colleges? Is it exactly the same, or are there some additional things we should be looking for?
Yeah, and I think Jeneé can chime in on that too, because I think she's got some insight. The insight that I'll share that is we've worked with survivors that are now survivor advocates, or college students that I've spoken with, that it can look a little bit different in that it may be a modeling job that's offered, or they're invited to come to an interest meeting. And that interest meeting is, hey, here's some easy ways you can make money, or here's an opportunity that you can get with a modeling contract. So it might be proposed a little bit differently than perhaps maybe a high schooler who's approached, whose parents may be kind of checking up on what those offers look like. So that's one tactic that I know that it would be a little bit different. Jeneé, do you have some insight into that too?
Yeah, actually, I have found in my experience that there are similar pathways, as you just mentioned, Alana. Sometimes it's a 16-year-old that might be approached for that modeling job, or a 19-year-old. But I also think that they're out on their own. They have a little bit more freedom. So sometimes it can be going out and just being a young adult in settings and after hours. And so they're a little green in just being experienced in the adult scene. And so some folks that are older can pick that up, similar to how you can pick it up with a teenager, maybe in a local mall, or a middle school student. So really, it's about having vulnerabilities that others can identify. The cost of higher ed can also be a big risk factor. There's an incentive that others might be drawn to, kind of the quick dollar. So an ad might seem really enticing because that school bill is coming, but indeed it's not a legitimate ad.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think that this really makes me kind of jump into a question I was going to ask later, but I think belongs here. What we're talking about, are traffickers who are exploiting vulnerabilities that either a person has, kind of come through in their life, or are experiencing right that moment, i.e. a transition, to a new city, or financial burdens and not knowing how to pay for those. So it's so important to empower our kids at every age to know how to be their own best advocate. But one of the questions we received, Jeneé, is what age is appropriate to start equipping our kids with the knowledge about human trafficking, that this type of exploitation exists, and steps they could take to combat that?
So I frankly don't believe that there's any age that's too young to start talking about boundaries, start talking about communication, start talking about when somebody asks you, or starts pressuring you to do something that doesn't feel right, places you can turn. Of course, I don't think it's age appropriate to talk to a second grader about human trafficking or sex trafficking of minors, but there are some risk factors that we can start helping to mitigate or reduce by building protective factors at very young ages. But also, in looking at the research, unfortunately, we know that middle school students are targeted. We know from our survivors that some of the times that they were first approached were actually in our middle school years. So depending on your school district, are you a unified, are you a K-8? There are definitely strategies that you could be working on to keep your students both safe here now and in the future.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And Alana, you created an education toolkit, so it's a bit of an encyclopedia compared to our quick start guide. But would you share kind of just some resources and some action items that are stacked full, inside of that tool that relates to this?
Yeah, there are a lot of resources that, exactly as Jeneé said, how we can talk to maybe the K-5 and the 5 through 8th grade, and then high schoolers. So exactly as you said, it may be boundaries, good touch, bad touch. What is when someone asks you to do something or says, hey, this is a secret just for you and me, helping youth and little kids understand that that's not a safe and trusted relationship. Also helping youth understand what is a healthy relationship, because sometimes that creates a mindset so that when they get into an unhealthy relationship, they're already primed for what an exploiter or a trafficker may do to them. So our toolkits are filled with several resources that will help with age appropriate programs and tools that educators and even parents can begin to implement in their homes.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Speaking of homes and just the way our world is right now, when it comes to just everything that a school can and should do, both their own internal operations and also empowering kids, right now, a lot of kids are in virtual schools. And so how does that change the dynamic? Does it change the risks? How do we still lean in here? And Jeneé, I'll send that to you first.
Yeah, actually, as we continue to work in the mental health and the social emotional supports and protecting our students around sex trafficking, et cetera, we noticed that COVID has exacerbated risks that existed prior to COVID. So students that sometimes had, very unstable living environments and maybe were exposed to folks that were outside of their household for survival reasons, or if we had, we know that students have been exposed to more domestic violence because of COVID. We know that child welfare reports have gone down drastically because of COVID. We don't have those educators where they're sorry about that, actually able to detect when something's wrong and report it. But I can tell you the other thing is we actually have a lot of students that have a lot of hours in their day that aren't monitored. They're not online with their teachers. So they're able to be out. They're still craving engagement. So they're on apps. They're out, seeking a connection like we all are. And so it's another opportunity for folks that have a nefarious, a goal to reach out and connect with those young people.
That's right. That's absolutely right. Alana, would you mind sharing a little bit of the resources that you helped our Justice U team develop with the online safety guide? I think that could be really helpful in the hands of parents and caregivers right now, especially if you're a little bit overwhelmed with what that whole technological platforms look like these days. And but we just want to encourage you because traffickers know how to exploit those, and you need to be equipped and empower your kiddos too. Would you mind sharing a bit more, Alana, there?
When COVID hit and the pandemic hit and a lot of students went to online learning, just as Jeneé said, you had a lot of students who were at home more. And so they became more vulnerable online. And youth who may not have been online with different apps, they started to download those apps, and that became a main method of communication. And a lot of people thought, okay, well, my kid's a really good kid. They've never had troubles. They're definitely not vulnerable. And the reality is that anyone is vulnerable, and traffickers will look for that to exploit. So we have to know the apps and the communication methods that the youth are using. So we took a grand spectrum of all of the resources that are available to equip parents, understanding what are the privacy settings that you need to know when your youth downloads that app. What are the ways that you can talk to your youth about how you share messages? What information you give? Do you give your location? What happens when you take a picture? Who it's sent to? So we've collated over 60 resources that will equip parents about all of the different apps that exist out there so that they can be equipped and then equip the youth in their lives.
Yeah, it's an amazing resource. So you can go to learnwithjusticeu.com/parents to grab that toolkit, and then, of course, just knock on our door if you have questions. If you knock on my door, I'll send you to Alana, by the way, but she is a rich resource for you. So Jeneé, let me ask you this. For the teachers and those who are working with our school systems who are on this call this evening, what are some initial steps or initial considerations that a school needs to understand or start to put into place? One of the things I know personally that we see, I won't call it a mistake, but it's a challenge, is that a school may jump into raising awareness, but they didn't have a protocol in place. And once they start raising that awareness, kids start self-identifying or identifying friends that they're concerned about, and there wasn't a protocol developed. They didn't know what to do next. And that wasn't a good outcome. So what can schools do? What should they consider?
Ashley, I love that you just mentioned that. That is my number one hard learned lesson, which is to make sure not only do your educators know what to do once they start engaging in prevention or in possibly intervention conversations with students, they know their role, they know what their state requires of them, they know what their county has set up, they know who they can contact. Because if you have a student start to identify and you don't have that set up and you aren't able to get that student to action, then that's actually a major missed opportunity and potentially dangerous. So I agree, set up, do your background first. And not only who are your partners, find out what your district is ready to support. This work is so important, but it can't be alone. It can't be one teacher in a classroom without building the readiness with their principal, with the district. If it is just feeling like you're in your classroom alone, there are steps you can take, but we really need a system approach. And, education is such a critical part of the pie, but they're only one piece of the pie. Child welfare has a role to play. Our other partners have a role to play, and finding really skilled parent advocates who are able to be along the journey if you have to have conversations with parents and parent and guardians. So really making sure that you're prepared for, rocking the boat and any wave that might come your way. The other thing is that different parts of the country and different districts have different readiness for this. And so you might recognize that while I'm eager to get to action, I need to fertilize the conversation. I need to get folks ready, because if you go too aggressively, you can actually get shut down. And now you had the right intention, but now the work is not able to happen. So, sometimes it's talking to school board members because they're the authority. Sometimes it's talking to local politicians and helping bring awareness. The problem that I have found is that folks like to say, not here. I get the data, but that's not my district. That's not my school. So any real life, of course, not violating student confidentiality, but the more partners you can come together with real life examples, then people can't deny it. And when people understand that this is happening in their schools with their children, they want to take action.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. Yeah. And for those of you who don't know, human trafficking cases have now been identified in all 50 states in the United States. There is literally no community that is immune. And if we've been learning about human trafficking kind of from what we've gleaned from movies or social media, then we're probably not learning the reality. One of those realities is presented in one of the questions we're getting now, which is how is human trafficking impacting children or youth with disabilities in our schools? Does it impact them differently?
Great question. I think as educators, we know that unfortunately, oftentimes we see students with disabilities overrepresented in various risk areas. And that is definitely true when it comes to human trafficking. The research at the national level supports that students with disabilities are overrepresented and identified as being targets. We know that they're overrepresented and identified as folks that have actually been exploited. I can tell you, we did what's called a social autopsy in the district I worked on, and we took 20 cases of students and that we had identified that as survivors, and we looked at the risk factors, and we saw a huge overrepresentation of not only students with disabilities, but students that were English learners. Again, as Alana was saying earlier, folks that had risk factors, it put them in a situation that others, again, oftentimes exploiters, would see that and target them for that. And we did see that in our local research, which, back to the previous question, that's another thing. Once you understand it's happening in your community, in your district, finding out what it looks like. For us, we started training our special education teachers first, because once we knew that, we knew we needed to start there. And that really helped us get momentum. And we felt really good about targeting students that were disproportionately being impacted. And then that helps the rest of the district get ready to address the whole student population.
Absolutely. What are some specific indicators? So if I'm a teacher and I we keep our eyes and ears out for lots of things, going on our kids' lives. And I will say, to those listening, indicators, it's hard to ask that question. I know it's a question I'm getting from several of you now, but it is a hard question to answer because there are so many, and it is so nuanced to what's actually happening, whether you're being trafficked by a family member to feed the opioid addictions. We're seeing a spike in that in many communities across the United States, whether you're being labor trafficked as a child, in the night. I've encountered that in our school systems. But what are some indicators that teachers or school counselors could be looking for, Jeneé?
So one of the best indicators that we can see in the school system is around attendance. When students aren't attending school every day or aren't attending every period, there's a reason. It could be because they have transportation issues. It could be because they have been exploited the night before and are unable to make it to school on time. So attendance can be a huge awareness, especially to scratch the surface and go deeper. But then as you were just saying, Ashley, the risk factors can vary. What it looks for a high school student, in my experience, I have to tell you, it was a significant change of behavior. Sometimes it was students who first presented quite reserved, maybe did not come with a lot of up-to-date clothes, and then all of a sudden watch them get pulled into a different friendship group, watch their behaviors change. Sometimes it was just natural adolescence and watching the developmental process happen. But sometimes it was because they were targeted. Just as we were saying, sometimes peers could pick up on the fact that that person doesn't have a social group. That's a new person entering my campus. So knowing as a school, as a teacher, administrator, we know when students have risk factors. We know when they're socially isolated. We have a sense of what's happening in their social environment, and that can help us, inform us either way. Yeah. I can tell you I've had a lot of survivors talk about just recognizing, because developmentally teenagers want to fit in. And when they don't have the latest fashion, that's an entry point for them to start to get groomed, et cetera. So if you even see somebody change in their appearance, and it can even be an up change, right? All of a sudden they're coming with more expensive clothes. But if you see the other, I've seen students who used to come really, put together, barely able to make it to campus. So change of appearance, attendance, behavioral issues. If there is exploitation happening, there is trauma happening. And rarely is trauma happening that you're not seeing in the school environment. And so oftentimes if you have outbursts, if you have aggression, tap into it and explore what maybe trauma history is happening, what is unsafe in that student's life that's leading to that. And then, to be honest, students talk. So oftentimes when you start to hear different things happening, and again, back to that sixth sense, when you're enrolling a student into your campus and you don't, who is that adult? What is that relationship? It doesn't feel right. Trust yourself and lean in and support that student and explore things that don't look or feel right.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a question we've been getting a lot, is even just this whole last year. And Alana, I'll put this to you. People have like this idea that students are just getting kidnapped, right? Or they just disappear. And that happens. Please hear me, that does happen. But overwhelmingly, what is happening is a grooming process. And overwhelmingly, victims of human trafficking may not even know that word. That they don't understand that concept. They understand what's going on with them. And they may have been convinced they chose to make some of these decisions. So Alana, would you share some of those mythbusters that we are constantly fielding, especially when it comes to youth and kids here in the US?
Yeah, so in addition to people often thinking, and we recently helped a case with this with a high school student where the mom thought trafficking was only kidnapping, but her daughter had actually been online communicating, and that trafficker had built relationships so that person was sharing a lot of vulnerable moments. And then there was a switch, and they will begin to groom for several months, and the parent said, I can't imagine that it went that long. And so that's a tactic that we often see, where the grooming process can take months and months, and then there's the switch of, can you send me this photo? Hey, can you come do this for me? Or you owe me because I sent you this. And so a lot of times that's what we're seeing. Is it doesn't look like maybe what we've seen in a movie of kidnapping. It's grooming, that it only happens in big cities. It's happening in rural communities, that it only happens with someone that I don't know. And a lot of times it's someone that person and that victim may know very closely, whether that's a family member or a close family friend, or just even an older friend that they maybe have come into a relationship with. So that's another myth too, that people think it has to be a stranger, when oftentimes it's not.
Absolutely. Well, Jeneé, how could schools, we've blown through our 30 minutes, ladies. We are closing in. So here you go. I'm going to tee this one up. What is the first step you would suggest schools take to start crafting their response?
I think we already touched on it earlier. I would spend time really understanding what's happening in my community, who are my partners in my community, what already exists in my community, how do I build on anything that's already happening, and how do I make sure that I develop a protocol that my leadership, that my district, that my partners, if I train my teachers to do this, at what point do they pull you in, partner, and what can they expect from you? And how do we have our systems start to communicate, start to really coordinate? And then everything else gets built on top of that. And I know for others, for some folks here, it might feel like, wait, I have that student right in front of me. I don't want to take time. I can guarantee you, you're going to do yourself, but more importantly, the students a favor by building it right. And then you really get a system happening.
Absolutely. Alana, if I'm listening to that and going, oh my goodness, we've got to get started. Do I go to Google and just start putting in human trafficking response protocols, or where can I go, Alana, to learn more about next steps and protocols that already exist?
Well, the resource that Jeneé helped to create is one of the resources that we have listed in our toolkit. So we have quick start guides, blogs, discussion guides, and toolkits. You can go to engagetogether.com/resources and access all of those materials to help you get started.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Jeneé, so much for what I hope is the first of several conversations about this important topic. We're so thankful for all that you're doing and for being with us this evening. Alana, thank you for everything you and your team are putting together. And please do go visit engagetogether.com/resources. Follow Engage Together on any and every social media platform of your choosing. And we will be sending you those quick start guides on the other side of this. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.